Well, it's a great honor to be here and a pleasure. And it's a pleasure to listen to Ada Yonat. It's just inspiring. And I can only wish that she's the first of many Nobel Prizes in the Weizmann Institute. I'm sure there'll be more. What I'll talk about today is a topic that I've been curious about for about 40 years. And I'm thinking about it very actively these years, which is there any demand for rational decision-making in society? There seems to be less than we used to think. About 40 years ago, when I started my work in this field with my colleague Amos Tversky, we thought a great deal about issues of rationality, and there was at the time, and still is, a very clear theory and a very clear conception about what rationality is, and it seemed obvious that this is the way to go. You want decisions to be made rationally, you want that to be done at the individual level, but more importantly, you want it to be done by institutions, both government and private institutions. And there are some principles of what rational decision-making consists of. The first one is you need to separate beliefs from desires. You need to separate what you believe about the world, what you guess about the world. You want to separate that from what you want to happen. So you want to avoid wishful thinking, you want to avoid all sorts of contamination between believing what you want and also, and that's quite important in the theory of what rational decision-making is to separate what you believe about the world from what you want to do. And there was a distinction that was considered absolutely essential between decision variables and state variables. The decision variables are the options that you have. So you choose to go A or B. The state variables are states of the world. And you cannot decide about states of the world. All you can do is you can guess about states of the world. You decide what you do. Now, it turns out this is a very subtle distinction, and people get confused all the time about that distinction. It was also important for a rational agent to recognize the existence of essential uncertainty. We don't know what the consequences of our actions are going to be. We are, in some sense, gambling all the time. We are making bets because we have to choose. Any option that we choose, its outcomes are uncertain, and that is why, which otherwise would be really quite strange, the theory of gambling is the essential theory of decision-making. It's the theory of choices between gambles. And the idea is that gambles are the best model that we have for options of action. Now, the recognition of essential uncertainty requires you to make optimal use of the information that's available. So a rational agent tries to use all the information that can be obtained. And by the way, I should mention that in our conception of uncertainty, there have been some important developments in the last 40 years. And I would say there have been some very important developments in the last 5 years. And I would include in that the work of my friend Nassim Taleb on the black swan, because he is proposing that we, human beings generally, do not understand uncertainty. That is, we are not wired to understand true uncertainty, that there is more uncertainty than we recognize, and that it's of a different kind. It's of a kind, and those are the events that he calls black swans, which are both extremely rare, so they're basically unpredictable, and they have enormous consequences. And he proposes, and there are many examples, of course, including the current world crisis, that human affairs tend to be governed by black swans. That is, that black swans have a disproportionate influence on what happens in human affairs. So this is really a new conception about what uncertainty is, and its implications for what rational decision-making should be are really unclear. Nassim is working on this now. That is, what does it follow? He has a book coming. I don't know how far along the book is, but it has a beautiful subtitle. And the subtitle is How to Live in a World We Do Not Understand. And that is a very deep insight, I think, that is quite recent, that we understand the world far less than we thought we did. But certainly, it is part of rationality to adjust to the existence of uncertainty. It is also part of rationality to make appropriate trade-offs. That is, we cannot achieve everything we want, so we need to make choices between our values in order to make choices between our options. And we must make trade-offs between immediate payoffs and delayed payoffs. And they have to be sensible. We cannot be completely impulsive and act only for the present, but on the other hand, the future to some extent will take care of itself, so that we cannot give the future exactly the same weight that we give the present. But finding the right way of weighing the present and the future is a major problem. So we were thinking 40 years ago that we have a pretty good idea of what rationality is. I think I didn't mention one essential aspect, actually, which is that we want decisions and people who make decisions, decision makers, to be evaluated not by their outcomes, not by their successes or their failures, but to be evaluated by what they do, by the quality of what they do. There is a rational process, and if you follow the rational process, you take a gamble, and it's the best gamble that you could take, and there is no guarantee that it will succeed. And so the possibility really exists that you make the best decision possible and the outcome is disaster, and the possibility also exists that you take an unreasonable gamble and it succeeds. That actually happens quite a lot, I think. A lot of the people that we admire the most in private industry and in government are people who have just been lucky. They took chances that they shouldn't have taken, and fate smiled on them, and they looked like geniuses, because we're all like that. When somebody acts on an intuition, on a gut feeling, and seems to be successful, we suffer from the illusion that those people have flair, they're somehow capable of seeing what the rest of us cannot see. One aspect of life that we're not equipped to adequately recognize is the amount of uncertainty, is the amount of luck. And if there is so much luck in the determination of human affairs, it also means that we ought to be looking at process, at the way that people make decisions, rather than at outcomes in evaluating decision makers. This is extremely difficult to do, and in effect, very few people do this. It is very difficult to give a prize to somebody who did the right thing although he failed, and it is very difficult not to admire somebody who was very successful although he really did something stupid in trying to do what he did. We do admire those people. 40 years ago, we had some examples, and by the examples that I'm deliberately picking very old examples, but those were the ones that we were thinking about at that time. There was a statement in Time magazine that I remember very well when Nixon decided to bomb Cambodia. So that just tells you how long I've been thinking about this problem. And the sentence read, and I remember it by heart because it was sort of shocking. The sentence read, "Nixon has taken a big gamble, and only history will tell whether it was wise." Now, according to our thinking at the time, this was really a stupid sentence. If it was a gamble, history is not going to tell us whether it was a good gamble. If it was a gamble, you have to evaluate it in terms of the information that is available to him now. There was another story, which was a tragic story, that happened here in Israel, when the Israeli Air Force downed a Libyan civilian airplane, and all of Israel was at the radio that evening listening to the chief of staff explaining with, you could almost hear the tears in his voice, explaining how he had made the fatal decision that caused the death of many civilians. And he described a state of uncertainty. And then he had a sentence that we thought was really profoundly instructive. He said, at that time, we decided that this was an enemy plane. Now, that is a very deep confusion. It's not your business to decide whether it is an enemy plane. This is a state variable. You can guess whether it's an enemy plane. You decide whether to shoot it or not. Now, as it happens, in that particular case, this decision that it was an enemy plane had fatal consequences. And the reason that it happened was that, in fact, as you know, those of you who are old enough will remember, the civilian plane was shot down when it was already escaping and flying towards Egypt. And the reason it was shot down was that they had decided it was an enemy plane. And if you have decided it's an enemy plane, even though it is no longer dangerous to you, which was the reason to try to shoot it in the first place, you now want to shoot it because you have decided that it's an enemy plane. So the confusion between state variables and decision variables is really quite important. And then we have the issue of generals taking risks. And the rewards that go to people who take risks that they should not be taking. And there have been many examples in history, I think, including the history of Israel, where people have taken risks that were unreasonable and have been successful and have been rewarded as if they had known the future when they made their choices. So we had all this, all these thoughts, and we thought it's so obvious that the rational decision-making is the way to go, that surely society is going to change, and surely society is going to adopt a rational model of decision-making. I mean, that was about 40 years ago, so I was still quite young and quite naive, really, it now seems to me. At the time, there was a proposal for how to make rational decisions. It still exists, actually, but at the time it was very popular. It was called decision analysis, and that was an attempt to formalize the decision process, to describe the decision process as a choice between gambles, to describe the nature of the gambles, of the uncertainty that faces the decision maker, and then very explicitly to present the decision maker with a set of gambles. Each gamble is an option, and it's up to the decision maker to pick the best gamble among the options available. This was the perfect description of the way rational decision making ought to be done. And there were several examples that were tried both in government and in private industry. I actually tried with my friend and collaborator Tzvi Lanier after the 73 war, after, not before, unfortunately, to try to develop a decision analysis within the intelligence branch that then existed for a while in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And that is when my naivete, I think, was cured or began to be cured. I tried to implement a rational process for strategic decision making. And the idea, I'll tell you briefly, I still think it's an excellent idea, it's just stupid. The idea was that whenever Israel takes an action, it is facing a gamble. Israel has certain interests. It has interests in, for example, the availability of oil. That was one consideration in 1974. It has interest in its relationships with the United States and not to strain them too much. It has a lot of interests, values that you can see that can be put at risk by certain things that Israel might do, or that can be favored by certain things that Israel might do. And so we had a process by which we could evaluate various options for the state of Israel, and I can tell you this really goes back a long way. This was when Kissinger was shuttling between Israel, Damascus, and Cairo, and the question was, how important is it for Israel to cooperate in achieving an agreement, and how much should it be willing to sacrifice in order to achieve an agreement. And so we did it very well, I think. We had a questionnaire, and we asked many experts, both within the government and in the press and among regional experts. We asked them to evaluate the probabilities of different aspects of what we called Israel's gamble. That is, what, if we take this action, is going to be the consequence for the probable supply of oil, for the relationship with the United States, and so on. And we learned quite a bit, actually, from this. Then we summarized the list of probabilities if if the Kissinger mission succeeds, if the Kissinger mission fails, what are the likely consequences? And I remember going to present this to the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there was a consensus among the people that we had interviewed. And we had interviewed people from the right and from the left of center. We had interviewed hawks and we had interviewed doves. There was a consensus that it was actually quite risky for Israel if Kissinger's mission failed. And in particular, one of the consequences was there seemed to be a consensus. At the time, we were thinking of war on two fronts, with Israel, with Egypt, and with Syria simultaneously. What are the chances of war on two fronts within the next 5 years, I believe, if the mission succeeds and if the mission fails? And people actually thought that there was a substantial risk that there would be war, and that there was about a 10% greater risk if the negotiations failed than if they succeeded. And I will remember forever, because at the time I knew this is the wrong direction to go. We're with the director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we explained and we told him the consensus of the experts is that if the mission succeeds, there is a 20% chance, I think, of war on two fronts within the next 5 years. And if it fails, there is a 30% chance. And he looked at us with a smile, and he said, 10% chance, that's a small difference, isn't it? And we were horrified. Horrified because if you stop to think of it, 10% chance of war on two fronts is not a small object. It is a gigantic object. It is a very, very big risk. But to him, it looked small. It looked insignificant. He was clearly not equipped to do the essential bit of thinking that rational thinking demands, which is really to think properly in probability terms. That was a completely alien language to him, and he was clearly not a good client for the kind of stuff that we were preparing. And in fact, I knew then that there was no future for that kind of enterprise, and indeed, there hasn't been much of a future. Now, a long time has passed, and all these ideas of achieving rationality, they look just as desirable as before, but it now looks a lot more naive than it did. The hope that you could get decision makers, that you could get leaders of large organizations to really implement the rational analysis of decisions as we thought about it. There is, in fact, and this I have observed, especially over the last few years when I get asked to talk to a lot of people in a lot of places, I can discuss this. They are all very interested in what I have to say about errors of decision making and so on. But when I raise the issue of what might this mean for your organization, that is, how might you want to make decisions differently in light of what I've said, this is where they really remember that this is really coffee time now, and we should really be doing something else. There is really very little interest, and we can see why there is little interest. There is little interest because leaders of organizations, large and small, mostly, it's a broad generalization. There are exceptions. I hope there are many exceptions. I haven't encountered all that many. They're not all that interested in achieving a rational process, especially not in achieving a rational process that affects their own decision-making. Because rational decision is, by its very nature, open and explicit. And leaders of many organizations are not very interested in either probabilities or in trade-offs that are open and explicit. Because when they're open and explicit, they're also open to criticism. They're open to criticism then, and they're open to criticism later. And there is very little demand for people to be second-guessed. Also, a part of the process of rationality was that, in effect, the leader had to receive the information, the intelligence about probabilities from the organization. There was an intelligence organization, and the intelligence would provide at least input for the probabilities of different things. Basically, it was really not the chief of staff's job to decide what is the probability that this is an enemy's plane. He had to concentrate on the trade-offs between the various risks of shooting a civilian airliner or of having possibly damage to Dimona. So it wasn't his job, but in fact he viewed it as his job, and this is very typical. Leaders of both governments and private organizations, they like to do their own intelligence. They like to do their own guessing. And that, by the way, the source of many errors in decision-making. But it's very difficult to convince them otherwise. There is, even as we see, opposition to data collection. Many organizations, including organizations that make many decisions of roughly the same kind, like financial organizations that decide, what stocks to buy. I very often have had the opportunity of asking, do you keep track of how you make those decisions? Because keeping track would really be the first step toward making rational decisions, analyzing what worked and what didn't work, doing some statistics, just thinking a little more systematically. By and large, they don't keep track, and they don't want to keep track. So when I say there is little demand for rationality, this is really, I think, a fairly serious statement. Now, there may be hope for a much more modest approach. And this is what these days I'm thinking about when I try to think constructively. There is something that I'd like to call the quality control of decisions. That is, just as there is quality control in many other aspects of life, there are organizations, the task of which is actually like a factory producing decisions. The product is a decision. And just as there is quality control in factories, there may be quality control of decisions. That is, there may be certain characteristic flaws that you can detect in advance before the outcome in the way the decision was made, and at the margin, you might be able to somehow avoid some of these flaws. One of the characteristic, the main characteristic actually, the characteristic error of many organizations is optimism. I mean, unrealistic view of what is likely to happen. And one of the terms that I coined, when you're a social scientist, you frequently have the occasion to invent words, so there is a word for which I'm known, which is the planning fallacy. That when you have a plan, the fallacy is to believe that the plan will actually work out. That is, that what is going to happen is pretty much according to plan. And there are a variety of other errors that are foreseeable and to some extent that are controllable. And there are certain things that we can do. I'll give you an example which is not mine, and with that I will close. It's actually the best idea I've heard in this domain for several years, and it's one of the reasons that I've become a little more optimistic about what might happen. I have for several years been engaged in a dialogue with an adversary, with somebody who really doesn't have the same beliefs I do. I have been involved in a critique of intuition for about 40 years, and this man is slightly younger than I am. His name is Gary Klein, and he is the guru of people who believe in intuition and who want to train intuition. And for 6 or 7 years, we've been working together on a paper which was just published. Actually, the title speaks for itself, because the title is a report on a failure to disagree. We actually didn't manage to disagree very much. But he still believes in intuition, and I'm still a critic. But when we look at facts, we did agree on the fact. He had an idea which is an idea that even leaders seem to like. And here it is. He called this the pre-mortem. And he describes a process where an organization, and that could be the military, that could be a civilian organization, a branch of government, is close to making a plan. But they haven't fully committed themselves to all the details of the plan. At that point, you bring a small team of the leading figures together into a room. You set a meeting. It can be short, 45 minutes. And the premise of the meeting is the following. Somebody, could be a facilitator, or it could even be the leader, he would say, okay, assume we carried out our plan. It is now a year later. It was a disaster. Now you have a sheet of paper in front of you. Spend 5 minutes. Tell us, why was it a disaster? That's the pre-mortem. It is brilliant. And let me tell you a bit why it is brilliant so that you may recognize what the obstacles are. In general, in organizations, at the approach closing on a plan, there is a lot of pressure to a closed mind, a lot of pressure towards agreeing. People who disagree or who raise doubts are viewed as disloyal to the organization. Pessimists are very unpopular. You like optimists. You like people who say it's going to be okay. This particular procedure legitimizes dissent. It legitimizes doubt. Not only does it legitimize, if you have an environment with competitive people, it actually favors a real attempt to look for problems. And there is at least a good chance that an idea will come, or a few ideas will come. That may not change the entire plan, but they may discover some risk, something that was not anticipated. I can tell you, I mean, I've had, a number of ideas. I'm an old man now, and I've had a number of ideas in my career. It's a bit embarrassing that none of my ideas has been received quite as enthusiastically as this one was. I presented it to the brass of the Israeli Air Force last year, and the commander of the Israeli Air Force said, I'll do it next week. And I presented it at Davos this year. I just mentioned it, actually. I didn't present it, but I mentioned it in a talk, and somebody very enthusiastically said, oh, I'll do it next week. This was worth coming to Davos for. Nobody has ever said that about an idea of mine. And that was the CEO of Alcoa. Clearly, this is something practical. This is something that can be done. And where this idea comes from, maybe there are others. I do believe there are others. And there is a possibility at the margin, much more modestly than we believed 40 years ago, possibly to slightly improve decisions and avoid some mistakes. We're not going to avoid all mistakes. But if we can avoid some mistakes, mistakes are so costly that they deserve avoiding. They're worth avoiding. Thank you.